Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first edition of the Sales Academic Chronicles, where today we have a representative of a group of very, very smart professionals, academic professionals in sales. So I am joined here by Professor Dugan from University of Dayton, who is representing a star team of sales academics, including Willy Bolander from Florida State University, Cinthia Satornino from University of Connecticut. We have Alexis from University of Kentucky, and Bryan Hochstein from University of Alabama. So again, Dr. Dugan, Riley, thank you so much for sharing your time with us.
Well, thank you so much for having me and allowing me the opportunity to talk about this research. I really appreciate it.
Indeed. And the topic of this morning's conversation is going to be about their recent paper, which is very, very timely. And the paper is titled, Whom to Hire and How to Coach Them, a longitudinal analysis of newly hired salespeople performance. And this is so timely because of the fact that there's so much talk about the new way of selling. What is a profile of salespeople that we want? Are salespeople today equipped to deal with all the challenges happening, or should we be looking at new people? So this is so relevant for the practitioner community, but we also need to have proof about how we have to dispel commonly held misbeliefs and myths about whether people with experience are better likely to perform in the long run as against university hires with inexperience. So I think given the kind of situation that we are in right now, I think this is so timely. So what are your thoughts on this, Riley?
Well, it's an age-old question, as kind of you allude to, Deva, which is, should we hire as a firm experienced hires, or those individuals who are coming straight out of college who don't have experience, we can kind of mold to be the professionals that we want them to be. And as with many issues and questions in the academic world, the answer is, well, it depends. Yeah. And basically what we show in this research is that initially, when you hire those individuals who have prior sales experience, right? So, for the first about 18 months of their tenure with the firm, they perform better than those individuals who you're hiring directly out of college. And yeah. I think intuitively this would make sense, right? Because, they have, experience, if nothing else, being a professional, right? So they know about time and territory management, which is critical. They know about how to fill out expense reports, log and track things on their CRM systems, things which it takes, people who are unfamiliar with that stuff time to kind of get their feet wet. But what's really interesting about this research is, in addition to those experienced hires, we look at two groups of inexperienced hires. One are those individuals who, are coming straight out of college, but who don't have any sales classes under their belt, so to speak. So, think of the history major or the accounting major who, it gets time, it's April or May of their senior year. They're like, well, I don't have a job yet, and I should probably get one of those because mom and dad aren't going to let me live in the basement. Yeah. So, they're like, okay, well, maybe I'll try this sales thing, right? So they get a job working in sales. The other group of inexperienced hires is one that's certainly near and dear to our heart, which is those individuals who have taken at least one sales course as part of their college curriculum. And so what we find is that, again, for the first 18 months, those experienced hires perform better than these two groups of inexperienced hires. But it's around the 18-month mark where those inexperienced hires, really their performance starts to take off, and they eclipse those individuals with prior experience. And this is particularly true for the individuals who have had at least one sales course. Their performance really starts to take off. And what's interesting about the experienced hires is that while they start off at a higher level, they pretty much flatline the entire tenure with the firm, right? They don't really get better, in other words. They don't, decline in performance, but they really don't get much better. And so, a sports analogy you oftentimes make of athletes is, they have a low ceiling, right? Yeah. So the floor is high, but the ceiling is not very high either. And so it's really kind of interesting findings. And what we also found too is that, this is also affected by how managers interact with them. So for instance, for experienced hires, they respond really well to role modeling. They don't like direct feedback because they believe it's kind of a blow to their competence. But they respond really well to role modeling. So they, emulate managerial behaviors as salespeople that they think are going to lead to higher degrees of sales performance. But the opposite is true really for those who don't have prior experience. So they really take well to reinforcement feedback, direct feedback. And so for all the talk out there about how millennials don't respond to feedback and they can't handle criticism, our research actually shows just the opposite. In fact, because as part of their curriculum, and having done this at Ball State, is that when we work with students in the lab, we give them immediate feedback. Right, on their performance when they're doing these sales calls and things of this nature. So they're used to it, they can handle it. And so they use it as a way to improve, just like they do in our classrooms. And so they respond really, really well to that. However, role modeling for them, at least initially, doesn't have much of an effect because, if you're inexperienced, you don't know what behaviors to role model yet, right? So you're not really familiar with kind of the ins and outs of the professional world. But as they become more experienced, we see that role modeling does have a positive effect on their performance growth over time.
Indeed. And I think that's a very nice summary of what your main research is about. And what I want to actually do is kind of dissect the reasoning and some of the things that people actually have in terms of what are the key things that you studied, right? So one of the what I really liked about the paper, again, was the fact that you decided to specifically focus on people with sales experience and people with no sales experience. So before we go into breaking down the people with no sales experience into sales education or non-sales education, to what extent do you think that there's a lot of talk right now which talks about, at least in the academic world, we talk about how the sales profession is changing. There is work that talks about how there's a new theoretical foundation of selling, which means that we cannot sell traditional products. We have to be selling more complex ecosystem-based services to the customers. To what extent do you think that this new way of working also does not help experienced salespeople who come in with a kind of a preset mindset?
Exactly. And I think you hit on it there, Deva, too, which is the fact that I think a lot of experienced salespeople are often coming into their new jobs, maybe, kind of still using tactics from their previous jobs, which may not work in this particular job, right? So let's say that their previous job was in a very transactional selling environment. Now their new job is in a very highly consultative selling environment, and they're selling a much more complex product than in their previous job. So maybe a lot of the tactics and strategies they use in that previous job are completely irrelevant for this new job. And one of the things that you and I do in the classroom is that when we teach students about sales, we really teach process, right? And so the product is really just an afterthought, right? So for instance, I've done a few sales competitions this year, and we've sold everything from, adhesive tape, to literally cold cuts like, bologna and salami, sophisticated software systems, conference, we've sold like conference attendance and things like that. So very wildly different products. But, the point of it is, and what these competitions really assess is not necessarily product knowledge, but your ability to handle the process. And so that's really where sales education, I think, sets itself apart, is that, these individuals who are coming out of Ball State and Dayton, all these other schools, they may not have the product knowledge. They may not understand time and territory management yet, but they really understand the process. And that's something you can build on, right? So if you understand the process, you're eventually going to be able to grasp those other things. And then you're really going to see your performance improve significantly.
Indeed. So for me, right, so because not every organization has the privilege or the kind of the luxury of going in and letting go of their experienced people and try to bring somebody new. Right. So which means that sometimes you're still going to have people, because your people are going to be hired based on sales managers whose mindsets might not change, right? So what would your research recommend to those organizations which are still bringing in experienced people? So again, what would you recommend based on your findings? Is it all hope lost for people who hire experienced people?
Not at all. In fact, I think what really helps those experienced people is particular coaching behaviors, specifically role modeling, right? And so, our research shows that they don't really respond very well to, critical feedback. They view it as a blow to their competence.
Interesting.
Because again, they've probably been successful using these techniques and strategies at a previous job, and then all of a sudden, some sales manager at a new firm is going to tell them, hey, this doesn't work. It's like, what do you mean it doesn't work? I've been doing this the last 20 years. What do you know? You're in management. What do managers know? I'm out here in the field dealing with the customer.
Absolutely, indeed, yeah.
And so I think, just how we interact maybe with those experienced salespeople should be different from how we interact with less experienced salespeople. Maybe more role modeling and less direct feedback. And then for, the less experienced salespeople, a little bit more direct feedback, right? Giving them more criticism because they're used to it, particularly if they've had that sales experience. And, another thing to note too is that, when we talk about like 18 months, that's when the performance of these collegiately educated salespeople really starts to take off. It's important to note too that at a lot of firms, turnover is so high that, after 18 months, you might have a completely different sales force. And so, in certain industries, it might behoove, a hiring manager to hire predominantly, more experienced salespeople, because a lot of salespeople aren't going to last 18 months in that firm. Right. And so, depending on the industry, that should really kind of inform your hiring decisions as well, too.
Indeed. But Riley, here's an interesting point. So when you say experience, right? So again, I know that this is a study, then you had a particular idea about what experience is. So how did you classify high experience versus low experience? Because as you said, I could be fresh with a sales education or not a sales education, but I might just bring in 18 to 20 months of education, which means I still have experience. So essentially, how do you define experience, and what should you be looking for when you say what is a kind of a cutoff that managers should be looking at in terms of saying, hey, if you're looking at 18 to 20 months, it's not so bad. Whereas if you have people with 10, 15 years of experience, you might need to think about different ways of coaching them.
Yeah, I mean, I think really, it was interesting because of the data sets that we had. A lot of the people who had prior sales experience, particularly at this one particular focal firm, had a lot of experience, right? Yeah. So it wasn't like, oh, well, I don't have any sales courses, but I do have prior experience, but it's like 2 years experience. Many of them were much more experienced, where the average experience is almost 20 years. And so, that's a really good question, right? So, what's kind of the cutoff when you're looking at prior experience as being kind of diagnostic of future performance? And so, my suggestion would be, I guess it just depends. And then, so particularly for salespeople who may only have 2 years of prior experience, my suggestion on the basis of this research, and also, from working with a lot of students, is if they only have 2 years of prior experience, make sure you ask whether they've had some collegiate sales training, because, collegiate sales training has really grown in popularity since the early 90s, when those first few schools like Baylor and Akron and Toledo started their sales centers, and you guys are one of the old guard.
Thank you.
And so we, but for the University of Dayton, for instance, we're kind of considered the old guard now, but we haven't had an official sales center only for 5 or 6 years. And so it's really started to take off in that time, to where I think there are now over 100 sales programs in the United States alone, and we're seeing increasing numbers of them in Europe and South America as well too. And so, if you're looking at someone who just has a couple years experience, I think it behooves hiring managers to say, well, have they had previous sales classes? Because if they don't have much experience, you kind of want to make sure that they have some sort of sales training, that they received in college, where they really understand the process. Because again, I think that's the important thing. Do they have the process in place?
So would you think it makes sense that, again, this is just both of us trying to extrapolate the findings from your work, to kind of say that the job of sales manager becomes all the more critical here, because they need to gauge whether, you're going to have all kinds of people coming into your organization. They need to understand what are the demands of the job and what is required of the job. And they will have to even go to the extent of, before coaching, even saying, if I need continuity of what we've been doing all along, I just bring in an experienced person and coach them, as you suggest, based on role modeling. Whereas if there is changes happening to my business, then I could bring in what I say is experience, but like with 2 or 3 years experience people, so that I can still do a combination of performance feedback, because it's still open to it and this. And then, of course, if I have the luxury and I have an organization that has a strategy, like a Procter & Gamble or a Sherwin-Williams, that says we bring in people fresh out of college and then take them through. But then, of course, if they happen to have a previous university education, that maybe we need to start taking a look at how we coach them and train them as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. And so, and I think that really gets at the idea of, for firms, it probably makes sense, particularly the ones that you mentioned, which are really large, to maybe kind of hire a mix of people, right? Because, I think it's important particularly for new hires, to, not only have kind of their sales managers to kind of act as a resource, but also experienced salespeople as well too. So, I think those individuals who are fresh out of college can learn from their colleagues with respect to some of these important variables, which, there's many things we can teach, collegiate students in college about, the sales process and things like that. But it's really hard for us to teach time and territory management. It's really hard for us to teach, here's a CRM system. Here's all the things that you're going to need to input in it. It's really hard to teach, okay, well, it's 7:30 in the morning and you're not feeling very well, but you've got a really important sales call that you need to make. And oh, by the way, there's 6 or 7 of them you got to do after that before lunch. Those sorts of things, right, that, you really only gain through experience being out in the field. Those are valuable, assets that experienced hires bring to the table, which I think that, the collegiate salespeople who are just hired fresh out of college can really learn from.
For me, this is what is really interesting is that this fits so well with the hot topic right now, at least amongst the practitioner community, about the concept of sales enablement. And where people talk about sales enablement as a technology, but there's more and more thought saying that it's not just a technology, it's about a whole process behind it. And if you take a look at it, and one aspect of the sales enablement piece right now is sales onboarding. And I think what you're making a case for is onboarding, but for a sales manager to understand that the onboarding that you have for a person who's experienced is going to be quite different from a person who is slightly experienced, and it's going to be different from a person who's going to be kind of experienced, and then the path is going to be different, including the coaching of it. And one of the things which I recently had a conversation with a company that sales enablement, and essentially one of the things that they talked about, which I really like, is probably the finding that you're finding from your research is, especially in the concept of role modeling, that you cannot teach things like territory management unless you experience it. So the concept of pairing up your experienced people with younger people is actually a great idea. And that could even look at concept of peer coaching. It's not exactly peers, but peers in the sales profession. And that could take significant kind of weight or load of the sales manager, because the sales manager's main job is to enable this to happen. And if they can talk to each other and they can learn from each other, and again, what is to say that it's just that territory management is going to be learned by the younger person from the more experienced person. It could be that the younger person can teach things like social selling and new tricks, and rather than it being imposed by the salesman. That's why I love your research, because there are so many things which kind of ties into what we are seeing in the practitioner space, but your research was so timely. And that's pretty much why I think this is my take on your research. Am I wildly off, or what do you think on this?
So I really like the idea of, and I apologize, my internet connection's kind of going in and out here a little bit, so I hope we don't have any issues with that. But I think, one of the really things that was really interesting about you just said there is that, with kind of the rise in technology that's going to like change the sales role a little bit, but also too, the idea of learning from one another. And in fact, I've had a sales student who recently took a job at a company that hires a lot of our sales students, and was just agog at the fact that, many of these experienced salespeople who had worked at that firm maybe 15 or 20 years really didn't understand the sales process at all, right? So they had like a training day where they were kind of going through how they interact with the customers. And this newly hired student was just, he fell out of his chair. He's like, man, they haven't learned things that, we learned in our principles of selling class, which, have been shown to lead to effectiveness. And these were successful salespeople. They had been working there for 15 or 20 years. And so, that basically just goes to show that, you can succeed in the selling world, maybe without, formalized training or without, like kind of a more formalized grasp of the sales process. But it certainly helps if you have it. Right. And that student has gone on to incredible early career success, in large part because of his ability to kind of manage that process. But, again, about the idea with respect to technology too, social selling, artificial intelligence, using mobile technology, in the sales process. Kind of the age-old adage is that young people really kind of understand that stuff a little bit more intuitively than us more experienced people. And I think kind of that sort of knowledge sharing is really important. So I think it is important for firms to create the environment where that knowledge sharing can happen. And so it really comes down to, a lot of firms, and you know this as well as I do, quote unquote sales training when salespeople are hired might be, a day or 2 days or a week. Some of the firms that we partner with, in fact, this is one of our kind of staples as a sales center at the University of Dayton, is we really want to partner with firms where the training process is months, right? Because, it's a complicated job.
Indeed.
And you're not going to be able to learn everything you need to know in just a day or two or a week. And so, I think firms, if they can afford it, really need to kind of increase the length and breadth of their training process, but also not only just have, the quote unquote sage on a stage, the corporate trainer up there, going on and on, but really creating an environment where these salespeople can learn from one another, because they all bring different knowledge and skills to the table that can benefit one another.
Absolutely. And now I have two big questions, and then I'll make sure that we address those two things. So the first one is, now going into the group between the inexperienced ones, but those with prior sales education, and you made the case, and I think the University Sales Central Alliance in the United States, which now also has members from Europe as well as the Sales Education Foundation, does great work in terms of talking about bringing cutting edge content to the students in these colleges. But what would you recommend when a sales manager, again, at the end of the day, a sales manager might only find enough number of students. There's finite number of students that you can recruit every year, so they might have to go beyond just a sales education. So what should they be looking for? You know what I mean? Or how should they be preparing to make sure that when you're onboarding your new employees, so essentially it's going to be fall, you're going to have a new cohort of sales people joining. What you do not want is those with sales education and those without any sales education in the same cohort, because then one might start outperforming the other, leading to kind of motivation issues. I'm just assuming that's the case. So what would you recommend for that?
Yeah, I mean, that definitely happens. And a lot of our students kind of talk to us about that once they start their jobs at the various firms where they work. It's like, my God, these people I'm starting with, they don't know anything. It's like, they haven't had any sales classes or sales training. And it's like, I feel so far ahead of them, and thank you very much for training me. And I'm like, well, yeah, of course, that's what we do. But, it's surprising, I think, to them how little some of the other new hires who don't have these sales classes, how little they actually know. But I think it's good. I don't think it's the right idea to separate those two groups. Rather, I think it's motivational for those individuals who don't have sales classes to learn. Again, because the idea is that, if they have a really good grasp of the sales process, these ones with the training, I think they can kind of teach that, off to the sides to the inexperienced hires who don't have that. So I think it's advantageous. But at the same time, too, those inexperienced hires who may have degrees in communications. We see a lot of communications majors going into sales. I think they can teach students who have collegiate sales experience a lot of things as well too, because I think they're a little bit more comfortable interacting. They may be a little bit more adaptable with regards to how they present material. Students who may have a background in history or English or one of these subjects, philosophy, which, we kind of poo-poo oftentimes in the business world as being impractical. I think maybe their perspective can kind of help inform, these experienced or inexperienced hires with collegiate sales training as well too. And I guess the long story short, I would say is that, everybody can learn from everybody else, right? I think it's always important to have that mindset. I remember before entering the world of business, I was a 5th grade teacher down on the Texas-Mexican border, and I was a reading teacher. And one day during my, my lunch break or whatever, I was reading a book, and one of the other teachers, came around and said, Mr. Dugan, why are you reading a book? You're already a teacher. And with the kind of the caveat that, I'm done learning. I've already reached I'm already a teacher. What more else is there to learn? Right. And, that kind of mindset, I think, is something that unfortunately a lot of people have if they don't, say it quite as brusquely, which is that, well, I'm already, a salesperson. I already have a job. What more can I learn? And, I think the answer to that, particularly as you mentioned, Deva, with respect to just how the sales role is changing, is that we can always be learning, and we always need to learn, and we always need to keep abreast of new ways of selling, but also understand how, there might be different perspectives to selling and different perspectives on how to relate to a customer that can really help us and inform our own practices as well too.
And I think one of the things which is my takeaway from this as well, this is my takeaway, and you correct me if I'm wrong, but my takeaway is that you're going to have, just like we talked about the difference between experienced salespeople and non-experienced salespeople, I think even within the new hires, there's going to be a kind of a gap. And I think what could be the case is that sales managers need to understand and work with them differently. I think you're absolutely right. That is, there's a chance to be learning from each other, but maybe kind of before they begin, like a couple of weeks before, just the basics of sales. What does it mean? A kind of coaching. And today technology makes it possible so that at least the process and everybody can begin with a common vocabulary, so that the learning that is going to come from doing is going to be much faster when you can actually, and I think that's my take on this, is that, you're not going to have the privilege of having everybody from a sales program or the sales class before, but hey, we can be smart about it and use technology to bring the basics like a week before they begin, and then make sure that at least there's a common vocabulary.
Right.
And of course, you can extend it further to actually then say, okay, after some point in time, we can then start getting them. And that's what I really love about your stuff, is that the concept of role modeling need not be restricted to the sales manager being the role model. It could be that role modeling could be on very specific aspects of the sales process. And the main thing for me is that the sales manager should realize it and should make it happen. That for me is the key finding. It's not that the sales manager has to do everything himself or herself, or themselves, but it's more along the lines of utilizing the resources that I have. And I really think that at some point in time, there should be a research that we should be looking at in terms of saying, do people with experienced sales manager kind of stuff, do they perform better than people who are novices in terms of sales, or people with sales management training prior to coming in perform better than people who have been actually in the job and had training from within? You see what I mean? That make for very, very interesting research as well. That's what you need. And one last question, which is what I want to ask you, is what I really, again, was wonderful about your paper was that you talked about initial performance and continued performance. That is performance of time. Now, that is very interesting. Why did you decide to do that? Because I think you were onto something. Why did you decide to look at performance at 2 time periods?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, because most research just looks at what's called cross-sectional performance, which is just one period in time. Like, well, how do they perform in March 2016?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's great. But, what does that really tell us with regards to, if we have an average performer, right? So we can have someone who's an average performer at one period of time. But, as any sales manager and as any VP of sales really wants to know is, what's it going to take for that average sales performer to become a top performer? So it's one thing to just get a snapshot at one particular point of time, but I want to see what those salespeople who we see performance growth, right? What are they doing that's maybe different, right? And so what's enabling those quote unquote average performers at one point in time to eventually over time become top performers? Because that's an age old question that, sales managers really want to know. And so that's what looking at longitudinal performance really does. And in one of our samples, we looked at monthly performance for 2 years. And another one of our samples, we looked at quarterly performance over 3 years, right? So we really kind of got a better picture of what it took for those salespeople to succeed over time. And another thing is too, if you're just looking at, 1 quarter or, 1 year or 1 period, it might be an aberration year. You might have a star performer who had a poor year, or you might have kind of an average performer who, got one really big lucky client. And so it doesn't really paint a very accurate picture oftentimes of individual performance.
And I think the fact that there's not enough research on, this is my take on, there's not enough research on sales coaching and the effectiveness of sales coaching. I think what your study also says that over a period of time, you can even measure, take a look at least seeing whether sales coaching has an effect as well. And that the differential effects of sales coaching, different ways of coaching, I think it's much more powerful when you show it over a period of time. as against just taking it a snapshot in time. And I think that's the takeaway for managers from this is the fact is that yes, I know that you have pressures on the job. You need to be performing very quickly. You need to be making sure that your team is hitting numbers. But again, once in a while, it's good for you to go back and take a look at whether your sales coaching behaviors are yielding the results that you want. And looking at one snapshot in time does not give you everything. And I think the key thing is that for you as a sales manager, partner with some of your local sales institutions that are there around you to actually give us access, because we can come in and look at it rigorously, and we don't have any kind of specific interest except to try and get a publication out of this. But the idea is that we can maybe give you better insights, and that for me was why this initiative that we have of trying to take a look at academic research and how we make it relevant to the practitioners is extremely critical to just highlight all the beautiful aspects of what comes out from your research. So again, Riley, thank you so much for your time. And again, please thank all of your co-authors on our behalf as well. This concludes the first episode of our Sales Academic Chronicles of all sales academics and the research that we do. Stay tuned for the next edition. Thanks.
Thank you very much.